From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV, Boeing, and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion about the importance of agricultural sustainability and the new pathways in agriculture.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here this evening. Am I echoing? It's not very loud, so I don't know if there's somebody in the sound booth. Is it okay now? Okay. Well, anyway, I want to thank all of you for being here this evening for our Conversations program. And before we begin, I want to extend a special thank you to the Boeing Company as our sponsor for 4 consecutive years. If any of you have access to Commerce Magazine, you might want to pick up this month's issue because you could actually call it the Danforth Plant Science Center in Bridge Park issue. And if you don't subscribe to the magazine, it's available on the web, and there are just so many great stories about the Danforth Plant Science Center and the Bioresearch and Development Growth Park that we call Bridge Park next door that I hope you will take a few minutes and look this up online. I also wanted to mention a couple of special events that are coming up. There is a inaugural Seeds of Change program. Seeds of Change is a new program that the Danforth Plant Science Center has created. And the first presentation is going to feature Hugh Grant, who is Chairman, President, and CEO of Monsanto. And that is on May 27th. And there's an opportunity, I think there were cards, you can reserve your seat now. I also wanted to mention that on May 24th and 25th, a program that really reinforces St. Louis' growing reputation as a world center of plant and life science leadership is going to take place here at the Danforth Plant Science Center. It's the Ag Innovation Showcase, and it is a combination of big business, venture capitalists, and entrepreneurial companies that have been the entrepreneurial companies have been selected from a field of applicants to present their new technologies. And the companies that are presenting are coming in from all over the world to St. Louis. So St. Louis really is establishing quite a reputation. There is a special pre-program we're calling the Prelude that for the Ag Innovation Showcase, you have to be registered and all of that. But the Prelude program is for anybody who's interested, and that's going to be a program on algae to biofuels, presented by our own Dick Sayre, who is the director of the Enterprise Rent-A-Car Institute for Renewable Fuels, and some colleagues from Washington University and other institutions. And that is going to be on Monday, May 24th from 9:30 until 11 o'clock. I wanted to also mention that tonight's program is being taped for the Higher Education Channel, HEC, and that's part of our partnership. And this program this evening will be aired, in case you just want to see it again, on Monday, May 24th, Monday, May 24th at 6 o'clock. And that will be on Channel 26 for Charter Cable customers, and on Channel 99 for AT&T UVerse customers. All right, so as you came in, you may have been handed a card, and we're hoping that when you have questions during the presentation, you will write your questions on the card and hand it to one of the pages walking through the aisles. But in addition to those questions that they will be collecting at the end of the program, there will be an opportunity to just ask questions from the audience, but please make sure that someone with a microphone has come to you when you raise your hand before you ask your question. And that, of course, happens as time permits. As always, I want to thank all of the friends of the Danforth Plant Science Center for their continued support. And for anyone who's not already a member of the Friends organization, I hope that you will consider joining. The center and the Friends play a vital role in helping the Danforth Plant Science Center achieve its mission. And just quickly, it's to feed the hungry and improve human health, to preserve and renew our environment, and to enhance our region as a world center of plant science. And now I want to turn this program over to Jim Davis. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robin. I want to join Robin's welcome to this audience. It's a good audience. I'm delighted to see so many here to listen to a conversation, take part in a conversation about an important topic. And I, of course, want to extend a special welcome to our two conversationalists. On my far right, Jan Jaworski, who is Vice President for Research here at the Danforth Center, is also a principal investigator and helps guide the research direction of the Danforth Plant Science Center. And then sitting right beside him was Mike Edgerton from the Monsanto company. He is a technology leader focused on corn ethanol, but interested more broadly in bioenergy and biofuels. He's, among other things, responsible for developing business initiatives in biofuels and developing bioenergy generally. He's been in agricultural research for a number of years. Between the two of them, I think we can learn a lot about tonight's topic. We're focused on agricultural sustainability and new pathways in agriculture. It is a crucially important topic. Because if agriculture can't be practiced sustainably, the future will be challenging indeed, given our needs for food, for fuel, for fiber. Agriculture has got to produce those, and agriculture has got to keep on producing indefinitely. But can it? Will it? I won't even bother to ask, should it? The answer to that's pretty obvious. I want to start tonight with two questions. And for those of you who've been here, the format will be familiar. For those of you who may be here for the first time, I sort of start the ball rolling with questions, and then in 15 minutes or so, the floor is yours. The written questions will be submitted. You get to take part in the conversation. You may direct your questions to either one of our guests, to both, either, or it can be undirected and I get to pick the person who gets to have a shot at it, though both may chime in. But I want to start the ball rolling with two questions, which you both may want to handle. One is simply, what does sustainability mean? And the other, perhaps more challenging, is agriculture as it's currently practiced in this country sustainable? Or are we overproducing or producing but unsustainably? But first, what does sustainability mean?
Well, if I could start.
Sure.
I think sustainability is a word that's often used in a really simplistic manner, and it's probably one of the most complex issues that we have to deal with. As many of you are aware, we recently got a $48 million 3-year grant that the Danforth Center is the lead institution on. And this is obviously a very large and complex grant, and part of it is, this one is focused on algae and sustainability dealing with algae. But part of it, the Department of Energy requires us to actually address this question of sustainability. And so we have a team of economists who are going to be sort of monitoring our progress and sustainability. And so they've given us a sort of a short talk as to the way they think about sustainability. One of them presented it this way. They says, you know, there are 3 E's that are associated with sustainability. One of them we all think about, and that's the environment. We want to sustain the environment. But in addition, there's energy and there's economics. And so we need to maintain the energy required, and then there are all the economic issues. Can we afford to do it? But they went on to explain it, really, it's much broader even than that. The environment has many different implications in terms of just the atmosphere as well as what we have down here. When it comes to energy, they talk about it in this context, it had to do with fuel, but really the way we need to think about it is in terms of calories. And when all of us think about calories, usually we're thinking about food. So we need the energy to sustain ourselves, but we also need energy just to do the things we do, which is where fuel comes in and things like that. And then the other is economics. And economics is a social science. And sustainability is a social question, because actually no single individual here can sustain the planet. It's actually a really collective endeavor. And so there are politics associated with it. There are many, many complex social issues that are associated with sustainability. And all of them need to interplay for this to work. And I think part of the question deals with tonight primarily with agriculture, but I hope by the time we're done this evening, you'll be thinking about sustainability very broadly and what really these complex issues have to deal with. And I think Mike at Monsanto has an even broader view of it than I do.
Well, first I'll echo some of what you said.
Is your mic on?
Yes, I hope it is. Can you hear me there?
Yeah.
All right, I'll see if I can do a little bit louder. So first I'll echo some of what you said, Jen. We tend to associate the word sustainability with the environment, and that tends to be where we start with. But when you really start to peel back the layers and understand what's going on, it becomes a societal question. There's a question of, as a society, what do we want? What do we mean? And what do we expect? All of those are very broad, open questions, and I think we can explain these, or we can give demonstrations of these questions using agriculture as a reference, but it'll apply to many other aspects of our life. All right, we, on the societal side, you may ask, what do we expect from our farmers? Do we expect them to feed all of us at the level of, as you said, 2,000 calories a day, 5,000 calories a day, 10,000 calories a day? There's a question of what do we demand. There's a question about how good of a living do we want them to have, right? What is an acceptable living for them? Is it $50,000 a year, $40,000 a year? All these societal questions come into play, and on top of that, we have the things that I think we tend to think about. We'd like the farmland not to be exhausted. We'd like it to keep on going year in and year out. We'd like there not to be a lot of pollution that leaves the farm in forms of nutrients or chemicals or air pollution. So all of these things interplay. And if we don't get any of them right, then, well, by definition, it's not sustainable.
Well, one thought occurs to me immediately, and that is you're talking about sort of societal values or preferences, but there's not one society. There's us, there's China, there's India, there's Europe, there's Greece, there's Portugal and Spain, the next Greece's maybe. There are a lot of different societies with different views on everything from the environment to calories. Clearly, sustainability is a complex topic, but maybe I'm being simplistic now, Jan, but I'll come back to that second question. Is agriculture as it's practiced now in this country being practiced sustainably? Or are we farming too much, too heavily, too intensely to be sustainable?
Actually, I'm going to defer to Mike. I have my opinions about that, but Mike works for a company that asks that question in a very detailed way, I think, every day. And so, Mike, why don't you handle that?
So if the term is sustainable is used to say, can we keep doing exactly what we're doing now for, say 200 years, 300 years? I think the answer is no. If you look simply at erosion rates, rates of soil loss are such that you can't keep farming and losing soil at the rates that some farms are losing soil on. I'm making broad generalizations, and you should always probably slap me when I do, because it
That's why they put a table between us.
Yes. It's very easy to generalize about farming, but we're talking about activities that are done across a continent. And those activities will vary greatly depending on where you are. If you're doing no-till farming and a corn bean rotation in flatland in Iowa, your erosion rate is such that you can probably do this for 500 years. It's still faster than the rate of soil replenishment. So from that point of view, no, we could do this better. We have improved farming practices greatly, such that erosion has reduced around for much of the country, but it could be better. If you look at nutrient loss, farmers over the past, say, 30, 40 years have gotten much, much better at getting the fertilizer that they apply to their fields into the grain or the oil seeds that they remove from the fields. So they're much more efficient at it, but there's still a good deal of fertilizer that's lost into the environment. And that also is really not sustainable. So I think that we have had lots of improvements, but there's also a long way to go if we want to keep doing this for 500 years.
So the rate at which we're doing bad things is slowing down.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So could I add that?
Sure.
I wanted Mike to answer that first because he answered pretty much the direction I thought he would go. But there's another part to your question, and again, it deals with the complexity of this word sustainable. So if we think about the sustainability of our planet and agriculture's contribution to that, which I believe is going to be absolutely central, I think that's the basis of the Danforth Plant Science Center, is that it's inconceivable that as the human race will be here 200, 400 years from today without enormous contributions from agriculture. I believe it's essential. And so the other half of your question, or the other side of that coin is agriculture and its current path going to lead us to a point where we are sustaining our needs? And now our needs are, this is the energy part. Will it provide all the food that we need? Plus, assuming petroleum is going to become too expensive to be a useful fuel, will it go a long way towards providing us with the fuels that we need in order to have a standard of living? And think about the United States, its current standard of living, and now every other developing nation wanting that standard of living. And so when you have countries like China and India, which are clearly capable in terms of their industriousness to elevate themselves, can all of this be sustained? Can all of that sustain this planet in that way?
Well, let me take one example of that. If the populations of China and India want to eat as much beef as we do, is that sustainable given the amount of plant material it takes to produce a pound of beef? I think you and I have talked about this, 7 pounds of plants for 1 pound of beef. Is that sustainable?
Sustainable.
Or will we have to go to a Mediterranean diet?
Sustainable or possible or desirable. All of those are different answers, different responses.
What's desirable may not be sustainable.
Or I think you can imagine a world, and I'm not saying this is the right world, where there is a great deal of arable, rain-fed land in southern Africa. There's a great deal of arable, rain-fed land in Brazil, South America. We can expand agricultural production into those areas, clearing the native vegetation, and I think produce enough calories to maintain society at a fairly high level of meat consumption and also deliver a fair amount of energy use. The question is, do we want to do that? Right? And then you end up, a subtext to that is, sustainability here is interesting again. Once you have cleared an area of land, you can have a farm and you may run that farm sustainably such that you can keep farming there. But was the act of clearing it and destroying whatever the native vegetation was sustainable? Right? And overall, it's always going to be some level of compromise.
So the environment is I think it's not sustainable if we're thinking about the environment. That's why I think you do need those 3 E's in there. You need environment, you need energy, food and calories, fuel, and the economic and social issues.
Even the energy question is interesting because agriculture has come as far as it has in the last 50 or 75 years because of the intense level of mechanization run with petroleum, run with gasoline, run with diesel. That's not possible in perpetuity, so that agriculture will have to grow, as it were, its own fuel. And can it do that fast enough?
There are actually parts of the world that's happening. In fact, long before there was ever discussion about biofuels, in Malaysia, where palm is grown as a primary crop, when you went through these palm orchards, it smelled like McDonald's French fries because all the machinery was being run on what we now call biodiesel. But
palm oil.
But it was palm oil. And so certainly, this is, I wouldn't say that's the model, but it's an example of what can be done. But once again, it means that we need higher productivity than we currently have, because you're asking that farm to do two things. In fact, really, in the best of cases, we want it to do three things. We want it to produce its own fuel to sustain itself. We want it to produce the food that's necessary to sustain itself. And, by the way, we'd like to produce a little bit more fuel so that we can drive around.
Now, let me add now two more things that make life really interesting. One is population growth. Put the population of the world now at what, 6 billion, rising to over 9 by 2050. So that we'll have to produce more and more just to sustain that population. Then toss in the possibility, perhaps the reality, of climate change. Will we have the climate that we have now, or will it be a more demanding climate? Will there be more drought, less water, and so on? Both those raise, I think, interesting new complexities in thinking about sustainability. And then, what about the carrying capacity of the earth? Do we need 2 acres per head or 3 acres per head? Is there a finite limit beyond which we can't go, just as you can only put so many cattle on a pasture?
Mike, that's yours.
Thank you. I'm sure there is a finite physical limit, right? If you're finally getting into just plain energy, how efficient is a plant at intercepting energy, and how much energy do we each demand as a person?
Right.
You can do some sort of calculation like that. I don't know how useful it really is. The best answer I've seen to your question about feeding people and a population of 9 billion, the UN and FAO held a conference on world food back in, I think it was November of the past year. And they went through some math to try and understand, if you assume improving standards of living, increasing consumption of meats, increasing populations, what it would take to get to 2050, which is where they're assuming that the population levels off. And somewhere not much beyond that where they think demand might level off, which is an interesting question. I'm not sure that's true. And their answer was that, yeah, it would take about 70 million new hectares of agricultural land, about 1.7 million hectares of land cleared per year, which is a fairly high price, and one that if your primary metric is intact biomes, you may not consider sustainable. So I think there's an awful lot we can do. The questions are trade-offs, and then ultimately this though comes back to a societal question. We've said the population is going to grow from 6 billion to 9 billion, and that every person who's born has a particular right to a certain amount of food and energy. We don't know what that is, and we don't really define what that is.
Right.
But if you make those assumptions, then the answer is we must do this. We must produce that much food, that much energy. And those are societal questions, ultimately. I think as scientists, we can talk about the costs of clearing land. We can provide guidance on what you might want to do to make the impact of that lower. But ultimately, most of sustainability still comes back to societal questions.
I think one of the things that Mike and I were talking about earlier in a conversation on another day is how these questions become political, because many of just going back to the question that Jim asked about meat, which is really a very good question. I mean, one could argue about how healthy it is to eat a lot of meat, but the fact is that we eat much more than most of the world. Not all of the world, by the way, but most of it. And that there are other societies that really want to eat more meat. And so what can we do to sort of justify or reconcile those issues? And sometimes that, if there's a political will, you can simply start to make some of these things more expensive. And sometimes, many times, those are really political decisions. They're not just you and I at the grocery store deciding, but rather how agriculture is regulated across countries, within a country and across continents, will have a major impact on the costs of simply what we eat. And that can be a driver in different directions.
Can you really imagine how Congress passing a tax on steak?
Well, that's a great question. But
Well,
you know,
they're talking about with soft drinks, for example.
So the answer is today, I don't see a big movement in that direction.
A big movement, yes. Mm-hmm.
Not even a little movement. I don't think the words have ever been uttered in the halls of Congress. Mm-hmm. But actually, I could envision a day where that actually will be an issue because, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were talking about costs of fuel and the need for coming up with fuel substitutes. And these were clearly an issue then. And in the last 10 or 15 years, other than initiatives dealing with research, virtually nothing has been done. And there's virtually no movement to really do things in that arena. But now I think with prices now sort of stabilizing for gasoline around $3 and no indication it's going to go down, I think I can imagine that at some point we're going to have to start to change how we do things. And I think some of that will be demands of society to politicians that saying, fix this problem. And so, you know, maybe 40 or 50 years from now, as agricultural demands around the world are increasing with this increased population, that we will start to have to make some of those decisions. The alternatives frequently are war, not a good alternative.
Well, you make an assumption, which I think is probably right, but still, I'll point out the approach you're outlining is basically having somebody says, we think this is good for you. Somebody else says, you're going to do this, right? Which is more or less what you talked about. Raising the price of meat is an example at that. Those are things when that's change being forced onto somebody for their own good, right? And that may be, well, why sustainability makes people nervous sometimes. Is that's often how things are discussed. You can flip that around though and look at it as a moral issue, right? Is what is the right thing to do, and how much of one thing or the other should you personally feel like you should be doing, right? And I think ultimately as we push harder and harder to move this into economic terms, we're actually going to lose, I think, some of the battle here, because it ultimately isn't economic. Economics do make people do things, but here we're talking about what's right and wrong, and I think we have to have some level of a moral understanding about where we want to go.
Mm-hmm. And that will take leadership, I think, at many levels. And sometimes conversations like this, other times education of society. But these are discussions that are not widely discussed. I mean, we started this conversation tonight, I think quite accurately saying that when people talk about sustainability, the word that they primarily focus on is the environment. And I think that is a very important component of it, but it's one of three components that are very important. And all three are important.
Let me come at the discussion now a somewhat different way. I read an article in Business Week a few weeks ago where I think your ultimate boss, Hugh Grant, said that probably the most serious problem facing agriculture was water quality, and certainly water supply. And so there's focus on drought-resistant plants. So put water on as part of the discussion, but what are the other targetable challenges that will help keep agriculture sustainable? What's on the horizon? What's on the research agenda?
So I'll give a few that I think are awfully important. The one is I've talked about how things have gotten better already over the past, let's call it 40 years. And one aspect that I think overall, I'll keep coming back to crop yields. Crop yields become very, very important when you consider sustainability. They're important because when I talk about erosion and erosion control, typically that means having residue on the field to keep rain and wind from blowing things off. The higher your crop yields are, the more residue you have. And that's what we've seen over the past, say, 30, 40 years, is the residue increasing and also technology improving that allows farmers to till less. The herbicide-resistant crops do a great job of beating down weeds that farmers used to beat down with plows. And that allows less tillage and ultimately less erosion. You think about yield again in the the broader context, which is if we as a society have a certain level of demand, how much land do I need? The higher your yield, the more calories you get out of each acre, the less total number of acres you're going to need. And I think that is an important component of how we're going to address environmental questions while trying to feed 9 billion people.
You mentioned pesticide. Does that raise environmental issues if it gets in the water supply, if it pollutes aquifers that are significant?
Absolutely. Pesticides and nutrients, fertilizer runoff, both can have serious negative effects, right? DDT is the I could never remember if it's DTT or DDT. And that's actually good. It tells you how long ago we stopped using that. That's a great example of a chemical that had really serious negative environmental impacts. It was widely used, and it caused bird populations to drop. I was up in Iowa this winter in February. It was cold, but there were bald eagles flying around, and you wouldn't have seen that a while ago. So the more that we can reduce chemicals, the better off we'll be for the environment. The nutrients also have clear deleterious effects on the water. If you're a farmer also, though, that's money running off your field, right? It's another aspect of sustainability. You really don't want this to happen. And I think that's one of the areas where we have made some improvements, but we still have quite a ways to go. Nutrients specifically. I think the chemical applications in the U.S. are less and less. As we increase production in the tropics further south where biotic pressure is higher, there's still an awful lot of chemicals used, and I think that's going to continue to be a challenge.
I think biotechnology is going to be, especially when we deal with agriculture, biotechnology will be an essential part of the answer to this. I think especially in nutrient uptake. So plants from the beginning have been taking up nutrients through their roots. We don't have actually a really excellent understanding of how that happens. There are many aspects of plant science that we don't have a really good understanding. But as we understand that issue more and more, then using biotechnology to genetically engineer plants so that they simply take up nitrogen more efficiently means that you don't have to use as much fertilizer. And the less fertilizer you use, it does drive the cost down for the farmer, which is really important, but B, as Mike said, you don't have as much runoff. And so agriculture is one of the most polluting industries because it's so broadly applied across the country. But it doesn't really have to be that way. It is that way because of our lack of understanding of plants, and the opportunity is not yet there for us to really engineer plants so that they don't need to do that. But I think that's a very active area of research in plant sciences today. One of the USDA scientists here at the Danforth Center is specifically interested in how plants take up different ions and what they can do to improve their health. And so all of these things are really important to begin to shift how we can get very high yields while putting less into the plants and less into the environment. And that certainly is an extremely important part of it. So I know there's very active research done at all the major seed companies in this area because they recognize that, well, as a seed company, I think this is a win-win situation. As a seed company, they want to sell the best seed to the farmer for the highest profit. The farmer, of course, wants to make the highest profit as well. And so if you can sell a seed in which they have fewer inputs, such as fertilizer and those types of things, obviously they're spending less per acre. And so this is really a direction that I think is going to play a very important role over the next number of years.
Now, one issue that I've read in that context is that historically farmers have liked to save seed, but also historically seed companies like to sell seed. And you see the challenge. Am I going to engineer the seed that's productive but has to be repurchased next year rather than just saved? Will that be a problem going forward, and does it affect sustainability at the individual farmer level?
Well, I'll try to answer that one.
Yes.
Okay. Save seeds, first, break the world into hybrid seeds and not hybrid seeds. Hybrid seeds are seeds that are made from two genetically different parents. And they're genetically uniform, but they get half of their genes from one parent and half of the other. When those seeds produce grain, that grain has then a mix of some genes from one parent and some from another in a big scramble. And the progeny are non-uniform. They don't perform as well as the F1 or the hybrid. So in a case of corn or many other hybrid crops, safe seed really isn't an issue. Farmers for probably about 80 years now have been paying seed companies to go through the hassle of making the hybrids for them. So when we talk about safe seeds, we're typically talking about something like soybean, which is our varieties that breed true. And they're, yes indeed, when a farmer buys Monsanto seed, they sign an agreement that says that they won't save this and use it again and again and again. As I think you know, our first biotech product, Roundup Ready 1 soybeans, is coming off patent in 2014. And there's been quite a bit of information in the news in this lately. And one of the things I found quite interesting is a discussion as to whether or not anybody will even use it. And the rationale for that discussion is that we often focus on biotech, but the breeders are very busy. And the breeders have been improving the quality, the yield of the base germplasm at a fairly furious rate. And at least what we see is that a variety may last 4 years or so before it's out of the market. A really good one might last 7 years. But the impetus for not saving seed is actually that the seed companies, us, are investing in improving the genetics, the base germplasm. And if that improvement is worth enough for a farmer, they'll buy it. So it is different with biotech seeds. It's also somewhat different with the breeding being done more and more by companies and less with government money. Mm-hmm. So it's an area to pay attention to. But right now, I think I'd argue that we're bringing real value to the farmers, and that if we stop doing that, they will find alternatives.
Reminds me a little bit, and this may be completely off the mark, but it reminds me a little bit about in the pharmaceutical industry, the challenge of coming up with better medicines at the same time they go off patent and it's generic. And the generic medicine may be cheaper but not quite as effective, but there's a cost-benefit test. And are there generic seeds? There must be.
There are generic seed. In the U.S., you can have an actual patent on an invention like a genetic engineering element. There's also a plant variety protection, which can be granted for about 20 years. Those, like a patent, it's a government-granted monopoly to sell something. Mm-hmm. But the cost of that monopoly is you have to show people how to use it so that it can be improved on and used. It's a very similar analogy, and I think we'll see how that evolves as the first of the biotech traits come off patent.
I think it's actually been very interesting that my wife also works for Monsanto, and at one point she was in the breeding organization, which is as one of the largest organizations at Monsanto. They invest a very large amount in breeding, as do Pioneer and Syngenta. And so the idea is not only to develop the biotechnology, but actually really to develop the germplasm at the same time. And again, farmers are independent businessmen, and they're very much profit-driven. And so having the best seed is really very important to them. And so I think the issue of saving seed was an enormous issue 5, 6, 7 years ago. It seems to be less of an issue right now. I don't think it's just because they've gotten used to it. I think it's because the germplasms have improved in such a way that now they recognize that there's a reason to buy the new seed. It's better.
I want to shift to questions coming from the audience now. And this is for the whole panel, which means both of you. Is the trend of increasingly seeing farmland grow crops for non-food uses consistent or inconsistent with sustainability? And I'll let you go first, Mike, since you deal with corn ethanol.
I'll try that, and I'll say it can be. It can also not be. It depends very much on how you do it.
Sort of in 30 words or less, can you elaborate?
Yes. So when we ask for a farmer who's been producing calories for food mostly, some fiber, to produce additional calories for energy. We're asking for more out of each farm or each acre, and ultimately we're asking for more acres. So we end up by accelerating the rate of expansion of agriculture. If in each acre you're farming unsustainably, farming more acres not sustainably isn't going to make you more sustainable. So that's part of the answer. Is you still got to pay attention to what you're doing on each of the farms, but we are by increasing overall demand, you're bringing land into production a little sooner than it would have. Right? Remember, we're not in a static land demand right now. I talked earlier about demand for agricultural land increasing about 1.7 million hectares per year. So you're not actually bringing it in land that you wouldn't have brought in, but you're doing it a little bit earlier. And that little bit earlier part is a question where it is adding an additional cost to the environment. And it's a question of how you weigh off that cost to the environment to the benefit of society of the extra calories.
I think I would add to that's a great question, by the way, because it actually gets to the core of what this conversation is about. I would say that using farmland for producing fuel versus food is at the very core of the sustainability question. Because remember, sustainability means we're sustaining the planet. We're not just putting food on the table, we're sustaining the planet. And that includes producing energy for things other than food, for producing fuel. So these are all problems that we need to solve and address. And by the way, agriculture is not the only place that this is going to be solved. As many of you are aware, there's a lot of work now being done at the Danforth Center and many other places around the world on algae, which was not being done even just 3 or 4 years ago. So that's in recognition that this sustainability question is not going to be answered by one technology, by one sector of the economy. It's going to be actually a multifaceted answer. It has to be. We're not going to create any new land, and if we're going to sustain the environment, we probably don't want to consume much more land. So we have to figure out ways of making the land work better for us without polluting, and think of other ways of doing that. And you know, in an ideal world, in several decades from now, we won't be burning any fuels. That all energy will be alternative energies. And certainly the Department of Energy is investing a large amount of research that way. But we're not there yet. We can't just simply turn off the gasoline pumps and expect society to keep going. But there will be a transition period, and there will be new technologies. But sustainability means generating energy, and energy is food and fuel. It's the energy that we eat, it's the energy that drives our machines.
Are there any plants native to Missouri valuable to this type of research, which I take it to be sustainability agricultural research? How can Missouri farmers benefit?
Well, switchgrass, which is always in the news as a bioenergy source, it is native to Missouri. Mm-hmm. It's native to almost all the U.S. It's east of the Rockies, but it's native to Missouri. So that's an example of a plant that grows quite well here. There is Show Me Energy is a company out in western Missouri which takes switchgrass and many other things, corn stalks and pellets and even shredded money from the Federal Reserve, and turns those into pellets, which they sell as a fuel for burning. So there are examples like that, right? And I think the real challenge is how do we, if we think that switchgrass is superior, then it's got to make more money to the farmer than whatever else they're doing, right? And I think that's part of the economic factors here is what will it take for someone to stop growing, say, cotton or rice or corn and start growing switchgrass? Well, the usual answer is they make more money.
And I think there are crops that are not necessarily native to Missouri, but which have not been traditionally grown in Missouri that will add value to farmers. And so many of you are aware that the Danforth Center has been working on a plant called camelina, and there's an active research program going on just to ask the question, would this be a good winter crop for Missouri? It will not replace soybean or corn, but rather be in addition to. And the jury's out on that. We don't know the answer yet. But I think those are the kinds of questions that really weren't being asked very much not so long ago. And now there's a number of us that are really interested in seeing if we can develop plants that would actually add value to Missouri and the Midwest in general.
I want to turn to the audience for last questions in a minute, but let me ask this question. Does sustainability have a time target? Is it, we can take our time, whenever we get there, we get there. Do we have 50 years to become sustainable, or 10?
I think the longer we wait, the larger the price is the simple answer. And so it depends on how much you want to pay. And because I think most of us would agree failure is not an option. And so if we're going to succeed, the faster we get it done, I alluded to this earlier, something that I would say is an irritation with me, that we've been worrying about developing new fuels from renewable fuels for a number of years. We've been talking about it, but there's been really no movement in that direction, as if petroleum is going to last forever. And we know that's not true. I mean, we know it with certainty that it's not true. And yet we act as if it is true. And so there really needs to be, I mean, until the BP disaster last month, there was already going to be additional offshore drilling. I think that's on hold now. But there's an acceleration of the use of petroleum, and that is a limited resource. We know what the reserves are in the world.
I'd say that the anything we talk about that involves change and usually expense, telling somebody to do something that they don't really want to do is difficult. If you want an example, I think that everybody can relate to on sustainability is look at our Social Security fund, right? Every year there's some poor guy who gets up in front of Congress and says we're going to run out of money in 20 whatever, and each year everybody says that's really bad, and then it goes away until next year, and we're not fixing it, right? So and we're not fixing it because we know that fix is going to be painful. It will involve doing things that we don't want to do, and so we keep pushing it off. And I think that's the question on sustainability overall is how long can we keep pushing these things off? What are we willing to do today just to make sure that our lives finish in a better world and our children's lives are in a better world?
I was thinking about this the other day when one of my grandsons celebrated his 12th birthday. And I thought that in 62 years he would be as old as I am now, and what will his world be like when he's 74? It's a nice question. How will we farm? How will we support the older generation? How will we solve medical problems? On and on, the list goes. But by thinking of him at 74, it makes the future concrete. And his world won't be like ours, not like mine.
And decisions we make today will affect that world, without question.
Sure.
Which was not so true 100 years ago, or 50 years ago even. But
or we were less aware of it.
Well, true. Good point.
Questions from the audience? I have a couple of written ones, but there are microphones. There's a microphone. There's a hand here if we need a microphone. And there's a hand back there that needs a microphone. Oh, there's one there with a microphone. Good.
Okay.
I would like to ask if you've investigated the non-native plants to Missouri as far as perhaps energy, like our lovely honeysuckle that's in everybody's yard, or those lovely sweet gum balls that we all have to sweep up. And then my second question is how do you intend to educate a population, which we have all just seen what we went through with health care, which, anything that we try to do is socialism. So how do you intend to educate us that we must do something?
Well, let me at least take your first question, I think, is there are a variety of plants that have been then looked at in many different parts of the world. One of the issues, and it's an enormous issue, is that whatever you propose to use as a plant, because we're talking about very, very large quantities, it almost says it has to be a crop, or like a crop. And so And that's a very small number of plants, and it takes a long time to develop a crop. So if you're going to deliver things by the train load, which is the way we want to deliver fuel, or by the barges and things like that, it can't be anything that is just growing in small quantities. I don't see those as short-term solutions, possibly long-term solutions. Even switchgrass is an enormous problem.
I'll echo that. I think agriculture is not something that turns on a dime.
Right.
When you look at just breeding a new corn variety, it's about 8 years. A new biotech trait is 10 plus years. I'll offer a story too. When I was an undergrad in San Diego, I lived in this really kind of rundown apartment because it was close to the beach and I could just barely afford it. And the guys the couple who oversaw the apartment the fellow was a retired Army colonel, who I thought was, why is he managing this kind of rundown, crummy apartment? And the reason is that he had invested all of his retirement money in a jojoba farm. I don't know how many of you remember jojoba, but that was the plant that would grow out in the desert with no water and was going to solve our oil problems in the 1980 energy crisis. So I sat down and did some research, and there are indeed people making money on jojoba now, farmers who can grow this and make some money. They're selling into the pharmaceutical industry,
Right.
but they're only on the second generation varieties. It takes that long to develop improved varieties. So when we think about new solutions, new plants, we can't expect these things to happen very quickly.
Right.
Now we've ducked your second question, the second part of your question, because it's kind of hard and scary.
I'm informed we have time for one more question from the audience. Back there?
Yes, I have a question regarding meat, going from plants to meat. Would you agree that CO2 emissions are increased by meat production, and how does that impact on sustainability?
Yes. So you take calories that you fixed in your corn, your beans, or your whatever, and you put them into an animal. The animal will turn those calories into meat, but they do that relatively inefficiently. If nothing else, they're warm-blooded, and they're going to use some of those calories to make heat and to keep themselves alive. So it is inherently an inefficient use of calories, and it's going to increase the amount of CO2 per calorie that we eat. All right. So that's a clear statement. And you can further say that if you're using a ruminant, typically cows, they're less efficient at turning calories into meat than is a chicken or a pig. So if you're faced with a choice between two evils, there's less CO2 per pound or per calorie in chicken or pig than there is in a cow. So it certainly is a component of it. Now the question is, what are you going to do about it? Right? There's a personal choice you can make about how much meat you eat, which type of meat you eat, what are your alternatives, and I think that's a question each of us can answer, and it's probably good for you to eat a little less meat. There's a societal question though that I think you're getting at, which is what right do you have to tell me what to eat, or do I have to tell you what to eat, right? And that's an issue we're going to grapple with continuously in sustainability. We're talking about meat here, but the same is true for the use of farmers' land. How many children do we have a right to have? All of those are major questions that I think society is going to have to answer and ultimately, again, become moral questions.
I think we've had our last question, but I want to call on Dr. Danforth to close us.
Thanks. I just want to express my appreciation to Jim Davis, who always does a terrific job and is beautifully prepared, and to our two panelists, Jan Jaworski and Mike Edgerton. Thank you all very, very much for interesting comments. I would like to remind everyone also that these sort of things don't happen. We have a planning committee that plans for the conversation series overseen by Matt Wolf. Will those on that committee hold your hands, up your hands? Thank you. And finally, it's very exciting to me because we've been talking about very difficult and very complicated problems, but they are complicated and difficult. And the more people who understand them, the more people who begin to worry about what's going to happen, not just tomorrow, but 10 or 20 years from now, the better this world is going to be for those generations who come after us. And whatever happens is going to take a lot of political wisdom and a lot of political will. And we'll hope that our children and grandchildren will feel that way. Thanks for coming.